A short guide to Impressionism. So this video is going to be a slideshow where we discuss hopefully some of the big ideas in Impressionism and talk about some of the big artists that started it. And in fact, it was a relatively small group of artists that started Impressionism originally, and it kind of turned into this ubiquitous thing that we now kind of misunderstand to some degree. But anyway, I wanted to start with Monet's Impression Sunrise because it lays out a lot of the big ideas that are going to be important going through. Now, my concern with Impressionism in this video is not in a historical discussion, although that'll probably come in just because that happens when I talk. But it's going to be about how to make Impressionism practical for you as a painter. And that's been, I think, a struggle that a lot of people have had, and so I'd like to address it from that angle. And we really can't do that without talking about some of the concepts that Impressionists used in terms of color, because in a lot of ways, it was one of the first movements, if you want to call it that, that concerned itself with color first. Like the idea behind Impressionism is that you're making a painting from life where you're recording the play of light. If there was a simplest way to describe it, that's a pretty good one. That's what we would say. But it gets a lot more complex from there, and hopefully we can dig into some of that. But with Impression Sunrise, it's a great painting to look at for this because we get to see several different angles of what the idea of Impressionism was about. So the first thing is what we might refer to as the handwriting that's going to come in. In a general sense, with Impressionism, there's no flat areas. There are no flat colors. Your surface gets built up, and that's going to be something I'm going to come back to, because once we get going with this slideshow and start looking at some of the detail shots that I have lined up, there isn't going to be a lot to say. We're just going to look at those and see what happens. But you can see in Impression Sunrise quite a lot of the sort of broken brushwork and sort of individualized calligraphy that someone like Monet was famous for. Now, the other thing that I want to point out is that Impression Sunrise in particular is an extremely disciplined and controlled painting. And that, even though Impressionism looks sort of wild and crude almost in its brushwork, the best Impressionism is very, very calibrated in terms of its color. And while a lot of the time it sacrifices elements of drawing that we would consider traditional, it more than makes up for that. And we're going to see places where the drawing is not compromised at all, and we're going to see places where drawing kind of goes out the window. Drawing goes out the window more in the derivatives that we get from Impressionism, where we get into people like Van Gogh or some of the Expressionists. But for now, let's go back to color. So in Impression Sunrise, we have an effect that I did not coin this phrase, but it's a phrase that I don't hear very often, and it's called equiluminance. And if you know me and you know me as a teacher or as a painter, you know that this is a big deal to me. I talk about it all the time. But I found that term in a book that I really liked, so I kind of adopted it. But equiluminance is where you have two different colors that are touching, that are different hues, but they're the same value. And so we have this classic example of that in this painting with the sun. If you were to look at a black and white photograph of the sun in this picture, you wouldn't see it because the sun and the gray clouds behind it are exactly the same value. And it's the best example of equiluminance in action I can think of. And this painting is also probably the best depiction of the sun in the history of art. If you ask me, I could be wrong about that. But you're welcome to show me a painting where the sun is depicted better, and I'll defer to that. But for now, I'm going to give this one the trophy. And one of the big reasons, like the way that this works, is not only are the two colors the same value, and we see that in a couple other places too. Everywhere where the red kind of comes in, the blue right next to it is always the same value. So we can go through some of the details and see that. But it's also a matter of the red sun being as bright as possible at that value, and the blue gray that's around it being as dull as possible and still being blue. And another thing that's even more interesting is that the complementary colors that we usually think of as playing a role, like if it's a red that leans towards orange, the complement of that would be a green that leans towards blue. That's not what Monet's doing. He's being even more sophisticated than that, because that relies on the coincidence of the color wheel laying complements out across from each other. And that seems to work for color mixing, but that's a mixing complement. What Monet is doing here is giving us visual complements to make the effect even more intense. So what I said before about the sophistication of the way that the Impressionists thought about color, there you go. That's the depth of where this particular topic can go. And don't forget that Impressionism is about color. It's the movement that sets up all the big ideas about color that happen in the 20th century. And a lot of big things happen, and they're really worth looking into, especially if you're a traditional artist who really just makes colored drawings and you want to get your work to the next level. This is the stuff you want to look into. All right, so enough with Impression Sunrise. We're going to move on to another Monet painting where Monet does a great job of laying out the mission of Impressionism, but he ties it really tightly to drawing. He isn't willing to compromise anything here. And this is, I believe it's the Atlantic coast of France, the northern coast. And he's got these wonderful, looks like a chalk sort of cliffs, kind of like Dover, but on the French side. And you can see the brushwork that he's employing. Everything is broken. He's making one mark at a time, and the textures that he builds are different everywhere. He paints the rocks in a completely different way than he paints the water. He paints the sky in a completely different way than anything else. Things that are in the shade have a different set of textures than things that are in the sunlight. And those are all really interesting things to be thinking about. Impressionism works really beautifully in the context of a landscape. The other figurative painting and still life painting, it's a little harder to incorporate some of the big ideas, because in my mind, a lot of Impressionism has to do with the time of day and the shifting of sunlight over time and the incorporation of time, which I probably won't get back into that, but that is a huge idea that can be incorporated into your paintings. And Impressionism is a gateway is a way to open that door. So, and then the last thing I want to say about this painting is look closely at the equal luminance that comes into, in particular, the sky. There's some really wonderful passages in here where these greens and reds and blues and purples get into the sky and they just glow. And that equal luminance idea is a way to get a little bit of a shimmer and a richness into your color. And if you know how to look for it, you'll see it everywhere. So the next Monet, again, it's another Monet painting. In a lot of ways, I think of Impressionism as almost like Monetism, But there were the big names in Impressionism at the beginning were it was Monet and Renoir, Morisot, and Pissarro. I was unable to find any good images of Morisot paintings, and I know I'm pronouncing her name wrong, but Morisot was a big played a big role in the Impressionist movement at the beginning. But we can talk about each one of those artists one at a time, in that they all like inject their personality into the work and sort of give us a bunch of different avenues that other artists would then pick up and run with, which happens in art history over and over again, which makes it kind of fun. But this still life, I don't know the date for it, but I have to assume it's a relatively early Monet painting. It doesn't have a lot of the hallmarks of some of his later work, and I don't know that even in his later work that he was doing a lot of still life. But the composition, the way he's organizing his values, in the flowers, his colors are a little bit generally simpler. His color complexity is nowhere near as developed. That kind of tells me it's an early painting. But anyway, I don't usually, in this one, I don't plan on focusing on the flowers. It is a beautiful painting, but it's not a mature Monet at all. It doesn't have the level of sophistication that we're going to expect from some of his later work. But when we go into the stuff on the table, I want to start with the apples and the grapes. And this is just a phenomenal example of how you can take a still life object that doesn't, the light's the same. The sunlight isn't flickering on this thing. The stuff in the front is in the light. The stuff behind is in the dark. But look at how he makes one mark at a time. And every time he comes back to the painting, he's got a different color on his brush. If that's the only adjustment that you make when you try to incorporate some of the ideas that we're espousing here, that will improve the quality of your painting overall from here on out, guaranteed. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But the surface that he builds in the fruit here is really, really nice. Monet had a tendency to build a lot of his passages up over time, so that would be like a series of direct passages on top of each other. And if you go to look at some of his cathedral paintings, the Rouen cathedral paintings, you'll see that there played out about as far as it can go. Here it looks like he's doing a couple of sittings. It's still pretty direct. The next painting is going to be by Camille Pissarro, and it's a relatively relaxed, pretty conservative looking landscape. It's not exciting. It doesn't have a big value range. The Monet pictures always have a really wide range of value. It's really dark, dark, really light, light, middle value that's usually right in the middle. At least for a lot of his paintings, he does get a little more challenging throughout his body of work because he just made so much. But this one is a little more relaxed. It's a little more compressed in its values. Its darks aren't very dark. Its middle values are a little bit lighter. And what he does, Pissarro here, is he sets up a scenario where there's very little value contrast, so he can ratchet up that equiluminance as much as he wants. And so if we go right into some of the details, we can see that Pissarro is like the logical impressionist. He's he's being methodical about everything. Like everything is a pattern to him. And the impressionism derivatives that we get from Pissarro are going to be like Seurat with his little dots, and Villard with his sort of almost like fabric pattern type shapes that we'll get later. But the Pissarro paintings they're really, really great examples of how you don't necessarily need to be a virtuoso painter to participate in the Impressionism experiment. And if you're not sure what to do, you can just be really methodical about it. And you can see his attempts at putting together patterns. And as we go through the detail shots, they kind of speak for themselves. But when we get to that last one with it's just a shot of the grass. It's just a phenomenal example, and you can see his little signature. But you can imagine how long it took to develop this painting, each one of those strokes. And the trick there is to use enough paint every single time you bring the brush down. It's got to be loaded, so you're not really repeating marks, like making 5 or 6 marks at a time and then reloading. You're making 1 mark at a time, reload, 1 mark, reload. And he does a little bit more repetition of his colors than some of the other Impressionists. And that kind of shows his paintings are a little bit flatter. They're a little bit less rich, I think, and a little bit less energetic, but still really awesome. So we move into one of the other personalities that comes in to Impressionism, and that's Renoir. And I had a hard time finding paintings by him that I had access to that I liked and wanted to talk about. I tend to get really bored when I look at Renoir's paintings, except when he's painting like this. When you give me a Renoir painting that is a little bit more traditional, a little more conservative, he is just firing on all cylinders. As soon as you give me some of those like really weird figurative paintings, like nudes in landscapes, I can't take it. They're not in the same league as the other Impressionist paintings. Let's put it that way. Although he does deal with figures in groups in that like speckled sunlight. Those are really paintings that are worth looking up. I didn't have any good images of those, so I wasn't able to include them. But no one does dappled sunlight better than Renoir, so I'll give him that. But this painting, it has... the thing I love about it is it's got a little bit of Pissarro in it, and it has a little bit of Monet in it. And he just does a great job of combining those, but he does it with his approach to his own handwriting, which is really awesome. And if we look at the trees and the roof of the cottage, we can just see how rich and the quality of color that he gets in there. All that red, and look at all the different colors that he works into that passage. There's almost no change in value in any of the marks through the tree, which has basically the same sort of family of colors as the thatch of the roof. And then when we go into the water, we have this duck pond here. And I want to point out that the oranges in the water, which are a reflection of the trees, they're all dulled down, but they're exactly the same value as all the blues. Running that equiluminance play is one of the ways that you produce the kinds of effects that the Impressionists got. Now, there's a lot more that we could talk about, but it's a short guide and not a long guide to Impressionism. So I don't want to go too much further. It's more of an introduction. We can do more later if people want to hear more about it. What I want to do now is show you some examples of some of the derivatives that came right after Impressionism. And in some cases, they were happening at the same time. But I want to show you a couple different paths. And the first one I want to show you, there's a little bit of a selfish kind of motive when it comes to this particular painting. This is a Vincent van Gogh painting that he made late in his career. So this is about as mature as Vincent van Gogh gets. And he was never really mature. He didn't paint for very long. He died young. We never really got to see him firing on all cylinders, but this is as close as we get. But the detail shots that you're going to get to see from this painting are the most detailed and just the highest resolution I've ever seen in any of the photography that I've been looking at paintings. So I kind of wanted to put them in a video just to share that with you, but also just to get to stare at these and look at them. So one of the things I recommend throughout this video is you know, when you see a detail shot that you really want, just pause it and take it in, especially with the next ones that are coming up. There are some details inside the details that are just so revealing and so interesting. Anyway, Van Gogh was not an impressionist, okay? He was what's referred to, if you have to put him in a category, a post-impressionist, a pre-expressionist. Really, as soon as he leaves Paris, he is no longer an anythingist. He's a Vincent van Goghist. And that's kind of, his story is a nice example of what we're all supposed to be striving for. Is you're supposed to be learning about all these different historical ideas and things so that you can find your own voice. And Van Gogh does that, and it's one of the reasons we love him. So this painting, he compresses his values a little bit. Some of his darks are pretty deep and dark, but they're just little flitting brushstrokes. But he takes the vocabulary of Impressionism in terms of the handwriting and also some of the big organizational ideas where he's compressing his values. And he's also running with some of the big ideas about color. So there's not a lot of things that are really new here, but the way that he handles the paint, there's something different here. Like, he's doing it all at once. There's no buildup here. He's doing this wet into wet, which, let's go into the first detail. And I gotta say, these red marks, if he's doing this wet into wet, I would have to really sit down for a few hours and try and produce that effect off the top of my head. I don't really see how he's getting that to work, but there it is right in front of us. So, obviously there's a way to do it. But the sort of leathery surface that Van Gogh builds here is just awesome. And it's really fun, for me anyway, to think about how this would be done. And I think the trick is to use enough paint. I think that most people are not inclined to use this level of volume. And I think if you give yourself permission to use this much paint, I think a lot of these effects are just going to happen. But his wet into wet technique is really, really unusual. And I can't stress that enough. There's only one other painter that I can think of that really produces a surface that's like this. And it's a painter named Monticelli. And in Van Gogh's letters, he actually tells us that that Monticelli was maybe not his favorite painter, but one of his favorite painters. And it was, he said in one of his letters that he was unable to discuss Monticelli without crying. That's how much he loved his work. And that wasn't even his favorite artist. His favorite artist was Millet, the French painter Millet, who was awesome too, and a pre-impressionist kind of painter. But anyway, the leathery surface that Van Gogh gets here is really something special. And the equiluminance that we were talking about, I mean, just in this one detail shot, we have the reds are, those pinks, those reds are a little bit darker, and then we have a little darker blue, but underneath that, pretty much everything else is the same value through this passage. And then the next one is a close-up of one of the trees. I think they're poplars, but I think that's right. And there are some deeper darks, there are some lighter lights, but you can look at some of those greens and blues, and you can see where the colors are the same value and where they're not. The trick is to make sure that colors that are the same value are touching. If they're not touching, they're not really doing you much good. They're not going to create that, that passage of richness. So value contrast usually in paintings like this gets organized. The high contrast get organized on a large scale, and the low contrast or zero contrast get organized on a small scale. That's an easy way to think about it. And the last detail is my favorite one. There's just a beautiful brushwork. The equal luminance is just really exactly what we're looking for. That red splotch is a little bit darker than some of the other stuff, but it seems to be something that he's kind of trying to highlight and pull out. But it's no accident that there are some darker green blues right next to it and just below it. But the really cool thing is that we know that Van Gogh painted on location for the vast majority of his paintings. He did make some of his paintings in his house where he lived, and he would do drawings, and then if it was raining, he would paint inside if he was working on landscape. But a lot of these paintings he did paint on location, the vast majority of them. And this painting in this passage, the detail is so close that you can actually see little stones that are stuck into the paint that probably happened while he was painting, or maybe he dropped the painting on the way back or whatever. But the thing that's really crazy to me is the color of the stones matches the value of the passage he's painting. One of the stones is blue, and it's the same value as the green. That it's just too much for me. I have to like take a break from to just consider the implications of that. It's just too awesome. So anyway, I'm going to move to the next painting, which is by Spanish painter Joaquin Sorolla, far and away one of the best painters of all time. He was working while the Impressionists were working. He came to the game a little bit late, but he and John Sargent kind of came up with this impressionistic mode of realism that is very, very appealing. He doesn't compromise his drawing. The level of abstraction is through the roof. It's kind of like, I think of these guys like if Rembrandt was making sort of plein air paintings, this is what we would get. But Rembrandt was more of a studio painting kind of guy. So and painting outdoors wasn't something you saw a lot before this period. And that's actually something that's probably worth going into a little bit. The fact that when people started in the 1860s and 70s painting outdoors for the entirety of the painting, not just going out there and making sketches, but trying to finish a painting on location, it sets in motion all these ideas because of again, bringing in the concept of time. If you're painting from, let's say, noon until sundown, the subject you're looking at is changing radically. How do you incorporate that into the painting if you're not willing to compromise certain things like the way you're handling the paint or whatever? And so we get this. But the Sorolla and the Sargents of the world, and Anders Zorn, if you're interested in this, is another. They're the big three that fall into that category for me. They take Impressionism into a slightly more realistic direction. But Sorolla loved to paint on the beach, and that's what this painting is. So he's got this one kid that hurt his toe, and the other one's helping him. And the detail shot of the head just kind of shows you where Sorolla's mind is at when he's painting outside. It's just the abstraction level is really, really high. His values are very, very controlled, and in this painting, they're very compressed. And by compressed, just to repeat that, in case I didn't define it better earlier, compressed is when the spectrum of value you're using is closer together. So your darker darks aren't that dark, your lightest lights are maybe a little lighter, or one of the middle values is pushing towards one side or the other. And that's what we get here. We have the kid's head is a little bit darker, and all the colors, like except for that big dark in the middle, pretty much all the values in the kid's head are the same. We can even see what may or may not be little eyeglasses on the kid's face that are basically the same value as the red that's in the face. And we look at the detail of the feet and the hands. We can see just this wonderful loose handwriting, and then the water just looks so watery. Sorolla was an absolute master, and he had so many paintings that are just some of the best paintings probably ever made. Definitely an artist worth looking at. I can talk about Sorolla without crying, but there are certain paintings that when I look at them, I get a little misty. I'll admit it. They're that good. And if you've never had that experience with a painting, you're just um, you don't care about it enough. So anyway, let's keep moving. We're almost finished. Um, we're going to look at Sargent, and most of the things I'm going to say about Sargent are the same things I just said about Sorolla. In my opinion, it seems to me that Sargent draws a little bit more in a general sense. He compromises a little bit less, but he's just such a master that he gets away with it. Um, the level of abstraction versus uh, the quality of his drawing is probably second only to Rembrandt, and Rembrandt is the best ever at that. Um, no one else even comes close. But this painting is at the Art Institute of Chicago. I've seen it in person many times, and it is worth the price of admission. This painting, in and of itself, it's very small. And these detail shots that I'm going to show you, we're going to see all the hallmarks that we talked about from the beginning that make a painting an Impressionist painting. But it's not like Monetism or Renoirism. It's Sargentism, because he really has taken it down a path that no one else really goes down. But you can see in the detail of the woman, we have all these blues in the fabric that are in the dark, and all the color changes that are inside there. The blues in the fabric are the same value as her face for the most part. That little brim of her hat is the same value as the color behind. Very calculated to sort of work up the richness of the color in all the right places. And then the handwriting that is classic Sargent. It's just it's exactly the kind of stuff that you want, and it's very, very appealing. Everybody loves this kind of painting. You'd be hard pressed to find anyone that's just going to come across and look at a painting like this and just be like, whatever, it's nothing. No one who's being honest can write this off. And then the hand and the face, the amount of paint that he's using. There's a little Van Gogh in there somewhere, but and it's more than likely all done in one sitting too. Sargent was somebody who could do that. Very, very difficult. And I wanted to close out with a mature classic Monet. I tend to go on and on about the cathedrals because that's my thing. So I thought I'd throw in a haystack instead. And I just want to sort of close the discussion out with this painting and sort of going through some of the detail shots. The Monet haystacks are just a classic example of the idea of time being incorporated into painting. And everything I talked about throughout this whole slideshow, you see it all coming together in this one painting. So to wrap things up, Impressionism, it's an idea that I think anybody can incorporate into their paintings. And if you incorporate the right elements of it, it'll develop really good habits, and it'll get you going in a direction that will make your paintings more sophisticated, more complex, richer in color. It'll get you thinking about the bigger ideas like time, and it'll also give you permission and the means to loosen up and have fun while you're painting.